5 words that would shatter the progressive movement's most fundamental myth. When John Fetterman, the hoodie-wearing, tattoo-covered senator from Pennsylvania, who had actually worked construction, who had lived in the Rust Belt communities that politicians only visited during election season, looked at Zohran Mamdani and declared, "You don't speak for workers." It wasn't just political criticism. It was a blue-collar reality check delivered by someone who had earned the right to speak for America's forgotten communities. In that moment, the carefully constructed narrative of progressive solidarity collapsed, revealing the uncomfortable truth that the movement's most prominent voices had never actually punched a time clock, never worried about layoffs, never lived the struggles they claimed to understand. And every working-class American watching knew exactly who was telling the truth. The confrontation had been inevitable since both men entered the national political spotlight. On the surface, they seemed like natural allies, two progressives who had won unlikely victories by promising to fight for working people against corporate power. But beneath the shared rhetoric lay a fundamental divide that would eventually tear the progressive movement apart. The difference between someone who had lived working-class struggles and someone who had merely studied them in graduate school. Fetterman's path to the Senate had been unconventional by Washington standards, but typical of the communities he represented. The son of an insurance salesman, he had worked construction jobs to pay for college, served as mayor of a struggling steel town for 13 years, and built his political career by actually living among the people he claimed to represent. His unpolished demeanor, his refusal to wear suits, his obvious discomfort with elite political culture. These weren't calculated political strategies. They were authentic expressions of someone who had never fully assimilated into the professional class world that dominated Democratic politics. Mamdani, by contrast, represented everything that working-class Americans had come to resent about progressive politics. Elite education, theoretical knowledge divorced from practical experience, and the assumption that good intentions could substitute for real understanding. His path from Queens College to Columbia to the mayor's office had been paved with academic achievements and progressive activism, but notably absent were the kinds of jobs that most Americans actually worked. The setting for their confrontation was perfect for exposing these class divides. The annual convention of the United Steelworkers Union in Pittsburgh. Both men had been invited to speak about the future of American manufacturing and the role of government in protecting workers' rights. For Fetterman, it was a homecoming. These were his people, the communities he had represented for decades. For Mamdani, it was an opportunity to expand his progressive coalition beyond the urban activists who had powered his rise to national prominence. The Union Hall was packed with men and women who had spent their careers in steel mills, auto plants, and construction sites across the Rust Belt. These were Democrats, but they were Democrats who had watched their party become increasingly dominated by college-educated professionals who seemed more concerned with cultural issues than economic ones. They had voted for Barack Obama twice, reluctantly supported Hillary Clinton, and many had defected to Trump in 2016 before returning to Biden in 2020. They represented the swing voters that Democrats needed to win, but often took for granted. Mamdani spoke first, delivering a polished presentation about the need for worker ownership of production and democratic control of the economy. His speech was filled with references to European social democracy, academic theories about post-capitalism, and promises of revolutionary change that would transfer power from corporate boardrooms to working-class communities. It was the kind of presentation that played well at progressive conferences and college campuses. But something was wrong. The applause was polite but unenthusiastic. Workers exchanged glances that Mamdani couldn't interpret, but Fetterman, sitting in the front row, understood perfectly. These were people who had heard plenty of politicians promise to fight for them, only to watch those same politicians prioritize other issues once they got to Washington. Mamdani's academic language and theoretical frameworks sounded to them exactly like what they were, the ideas of someone who had never actually done their jobs. When Fetterman took the stage, the atmosphere changed immediately. He didn't walk to the podium, he lumbered, his 6'8" frame moving with the deliberate gait of someone who had spent years doing physical labor. He wore his signature hoodie and cargo shorts, looking more like someone who had just finished a shift than a United States senator. But it was when he began to speak that the real contrast became clear. "I've been listening to a lot of talk about workers today," Fetterman began, his voice carrying the flat vowels of Western Pennsylvania. "And some of it sounds real nice. Democratic control of the economy, worker ownership, revolutionary change. But you know what I haven't heard much about? Jobs." The crowd stirred. This was language they understood. See, I spent 13 years as mayor of Braddock, which used to be a steel town until the mill closed, and took 8,000 jobs with it. And I learned something in those 13 years that I don't think you learn in grad school. Workers don't need revolutionary theories. They need work. The applause was immediate and sustained. Fetterman had cut through all the progressive rhetoric to address the fundamental concern of everyone in that room: economic security for working families. But it was what came next that would destroy Mamdani's credibility with working-class voters forever. I keep hearing politicians talk about speaking for workers, Fetterman continued, his voice taking on an edge that made several union leaders lean forward. But let me ask you something. How many of those politicians have ever actually been workers? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew he was talking about Mamdani, who was still sitting in the front row looking increasingly uncomfortable. How many have punched a time clock? How many have worried about their shift getting cut? How many have had to choose between paying rent and fixing their car? How many have ever had a boss who didn't give a damn about their theories, just about whether they showed up and did the work? Each question hit harder than the last. Fetterman was systematically dismantling the idea that academic knowledge about working-class issues could substitute for lived experience. Because here's the thing, Fetterman said, his voice rising. You can't speak for workers if you've never been one. You can't represent working families if you've never lived like one. And you sure as hell can't promise to fix problems that you've never actually faced. The crowd was now fully engaged, recognizing the authenticity of someone who was speaking their language about their experiences. But Fetterman still wasn't finished. I've heard a lot about democratic socialism today, about European models, about revolutionary change. But you know what model I'm interested in? The model where working people can afford to live in the communities where they work, where a manufacturing job can still support a family, where people don't need 3 jobs just to pay rent. The contrast with Mamdani's theoretical presentation was stark. While the mayor had talked about systemic change and post-capitalist futures, Fetterman was addressing the immediate concerns that kept working people awake at night. Then came the moment that would define the rest of the progressive movement's relationship with working-class voters. Some politicians think they can speak for workers because they support the right policies or use the right rhetoric, Fetterman said, looking directly at Mamdani. But supporting workers and being one of us aren't the same thing. And pretending they are is exactly the kind of elite condescension that drives working people away from our party. The criticism was devastating because it came from within the progressive movement itself. This wasn't a conservative attacking progressive politics. This was one progressive calling out another for being inauthentic. You don't speak for workers, Fetterman declared, his voice carrying across the silent union hall. You speak for people who study workers, who theorize about workers, who write papers about workers, but you've never been one of us, and it shows. The silence that followed was deafening. In 30 years of union conventions, nobody could remember seeing a politician so thoroughly destroyed by a member of his own party. Mamdani sat frozen, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge to his progressive credentials from someone with unassailable working-class authenticity. When Mamdani tried to respond during the Q&A session, the damage was already done. His attempt to defend his record fell flat because Fetterman had exposed the fundamental weakness in his political identity. He was advocating for a class he had never belonged to, speaking for people whose lives he had never lived. Senator Fetterman, with respect, to 70, Mamdani began, his voice betraying his nervousness. I think we share the same goals of economic justice and worker empowerment. Fetterman's response was swift and brutal. Goals aren't enough, he shot back. I don't want to empower workers, I am a worker. This isn't theoretical for me. When plants close in my state, those are my neighbors losing their jobs. When healthcare costs go up, that's my family struggling to pay bills. You can't represent people you've never been. The exchange crystallized everything that was wrong with contemporary progressive politics in the eyes of working-class voters. Here was a movement that claimed to champion working people, but was increasingly dominated by college-educated professionals who had never done the jobs they were promising to protect. The reaction from the union crowd was immediate and unequivocal. When Fetterman finished speaking, he received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. When Mamdani concluded his remarks, the applause was perfunctory at best. The message was clear. working people could tell the difference between authentic representation and performative solidarity. The media coverage of the exchange was devastating for Mamdani's national ambitions. Headlines across the country highlighted the class divide within the progressive movement. Fetterman exposes progressive elite problem, working class. Senator School's socialist mayor, the progressive movement's authenticity crisis. But the real damage came from working-class Democrats themselves. Social media filled with posts from union members, construction workers, and manufacturing employees sharing their own stories about politicians who claimed to represent them but clearly didn't understand their lives. The hashtag number #YouDon'tSpeakForWorkers trended nationally, with thousands of working people expressing frustration with progressive politicians who theorized about their struggles rather than living them. Most significantly, the exchange highlighted a fundamental strategic problem for the Democratic Party. If progressives couldn't credibly represent working-class interests, how could they build the coalition needed to win elections in industrial states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin? Fetterman's critique wasn't just personal, it was political, exposing the gap between progressive rhetoric and working-class reality that had cost Democrats elections in the past. The long-term consequences for Mamdani were swift and severe. Within weeks of the Pittsburgh confrontation, several major unions quietly withdrew their support for his initiatives. Labor leaders who had initially been intrigued by his progressive rhetoric began questioning whether he truly understood their members' priorities. Most damaging of all, working-class voters in swing districts started viewing him as another elite politician who talked a good game but lacked authentic connection to their communities. For Fetterman, the exchange reinforced his position as the Democratic Party's most authentic working-class voice. His approval ratings in Pennsylvania soared, and he began receiving invitations to speak in other industrial states where Democrats were struggling to connect with blue-collar voters. Party strategists who had once viewed his unconventional style as a liability now saw it as an asset in reaching the working-class voters that progressives had alienated. But beyond the immediate political implications, the confrontation exposed deeper fractures within the progressive movement itself. Fetterman had given voice to something that many working-class Democrats had felt but couldn't articulate, that their supposed champions didn't really understand them. The movement that claimed to represent the working class was increasingly dominated by people who had never been part of it. The irony was devastating. Progressive politics, which had emerged from labor movements and working-class organizing, had become so intellectualized and professionalized that it had lost touch with the very people it claimed to represent. Mamdani's graduate school approach to working-class issues exemplified everything that authentic working people found alienating about contemporary liberalism. 3 months after Pittsburgh, internal Democratic polling showed the lasting impact of Fetterman's critique. Working-class voters expressed significantly higher trust in politicians who had actually worked blue-collar jobs, and correspondingly lower trust in those whose only connection to working-class issues was ideological. The Fetterman standard, the expectation that politicians representing workers should have actually been workers themselves, became a benchmark that many progressive politicians couldn't meet. The progressive movement faced a choice: continue to be dominated by college-educated professionals who theorized about working-class issues, or find ways to elevate authentic working-class voices who could speak from experience rather than ideology. Fetterman's devastating critique of Mamdani had made clear that the movement's credibility with working voters depended on choosing authenticity over academic theory. As one longtime union organizer put it after the Pittsburgh confrontation, "Finally, somebody said what we've all been thinking. You can't represent us if you've never been us, and all the graduate degrees in the world can't change that fact." The progressive movement had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth, that good intentions and correct politics weren't enough if they came from people who had never lived the struggles they claimed to understand. Fetterman's 5 words, "You don't speak for workers," had shattered the myth that academic knowledge could substitute for authentic experience, leaving progressive politicians to figure out how to rebuild their credibility with the working-class voters they claimed to champion but had clearly never understood.